We already, in our previous meetings within this topic, discussed the social and rational imperative as distinct from the Torah, in which we developed the notion of an innate moral sense and its resonance with the Noahide covenant, that as distinct from the Torah. We also discussed separately the inscrutable authoritarian imperative, the Torah, as a chok, and in this regard, of course, focused first and foremost on the extent to which this is indeed in contradistinction to the social and rational imperative. One can intuit the system of the Noahide laws. To that extent, they can be an autonomous system of morality. The Torah is clearly heteronymous. You need to learn the Torah in order to know it. And moreover, there are going to be aspects of the Torah that are going to fly in the face of our natural moral sense. The extirpation of the Canaanite nations and of Amalek are obvious examples. We also discussed the Akedah, the binding of Yitzchak, and more generally, the realization that on some plane, the imperative of the Torah is to submit. We take that innate moral sense and we don't bludgeon it to death, but we do bludgeon it into submission. And beyond that, the dimension that we discussed last time, and that is interpersonal mitzvot, and beyond the Torah as a divinely ordained moral code, where on the one hand, of course, that was precisely the counterbalance to the Torah as chok, the realization that there are a great many mitzvot that are indeed mitzvot that resonate with our moral sense, and to that extent that the Torah signifies a divinely ordained moral code as opposed to a merely terrestrial one. And it was likewise in that vein that we noted that the extent to which there is an inherent moral message is not limited to those mitzvot that are overtly interpersonal. Of course, the obvious example upon which we dwell to not merely a small measure is the mitzvah of Ahavat Hashem, loving God, that encompasses within it, as the Gemara intimates and the Midrash makes explicit, and Rambam also codifies in Sefer HaMitzvot, to cause God's name to be beloved, to behave in a manner that is upright, that is consonant with our sense of morality, which inspires people to feel an adoration of the Torah and its giver. Okay, at this point, we consider an additional dimension, the additional dimension that might, at first blush, seem to be identical with the dimension that we discussed last time, that is the interpersonal mitzvot and beyond, the Torah as a divinely ordained moral code. What we're going to be focusing upon at present is an inner dynamism. Not merely our fidelity to the mitzvot, not merely obedience as something that will be coherent with our sense of morality, but also the Torah as influencing us and transforming us. So I know at the outset, perhaps on the most rudimentary plane, something that doesn't have anything to do per se with morality, the manner in which the Gemara, in particular in Masechet Avodah Zarah, on page 19a, likewise in Kiddushin on page 32b, and a number of additional cognate Gemarot that enunciate the same essential idea, commenting on the second verse of Tehillim, which begins with the words, Ki im b'Torat Hashem cheftso. His desire is in the Torah of God, and the comment in this vein of Rava, Le'olam yolamad adam Torah b'makom shelibo chafetz. Statement number one, person should study Torah where his heart desires. And statement number 2, ve'amar Rava, bitchila nikret al shmo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'bassof nikret al shmo. So the Torah is initially described as the Torah of God. Ki im b'torat Hashem chevtzo. And then there is a built-in, if you will, grammatical ambiguity in the second half of the pasuk. Uvtorato yihegeh yomam v'layla. And his Torah he articulates day and night. The problem, what we would describe in the rules of grammar as an unclear antecedent. Whose Torah? Because after all, there are two possibilities that arise from the first clause of the pasuk. Is uvtorato referring to the Torah of God, or is it the Torah referring to the person? The person is described already in the first pasuk. His desire is in the Torah of God. So when we continue, Torato, whose Torah is it? Is it God's or is it the students? And Rava gives us these two statements. On the one hand, that a person can only learn Torah from where his heart desires, and number two, that the Torah itself is initially referred to as the Torah of the Holy and Blessed be He, God's Torah, but ultimately, Uvtorato yegeh yomam v'layla means his Torah, the student's Torah. He articulates day and night because the Torah becomes his own. And ultimately, of course, we appreciate the implication of both statements of Rava is there needs to be some kind of resonance established. That needs to be antecedent to the study of Torah, which is why a person can only really learn what his heart desires. But the consequence of that resonance is, as it were, transformative, not just with respect to the student, but with respect to the Torah. The Torah becomes his Torah. As Rav Detzer expresses it in Michtav Me'Eliyahu, when a person not only is lomed Torah Hashem Yitbarach, but umitmaser ela b'chol libo umitavek ba. When a person really becomes adherent to the Torah, then he comes to feel that the Torah is his own. Meaning, obviously, this should not be taken to imply that whatever I want, I'll read into the Torah, but rather that what I want is derived from what the Torah tells me. That process of inner transformation as I become, if you will, incrementally more resonant with the Torah. Now, again, this doesn't have to do with morality per se, or morality exclusively. It pertains to the gamut of what the Torah is saying and the extent to which I become transformed by the Torah. But if anything, it is most accentuated, as we will yet see in Rambam, in that domain with respect to which we do establish this kind of natural resonance. That is, by engaging in the Torah, we grow into that which the Torah is molding us to become. And to illustrate this point, if anything, I'd like to cite a passage from Sefer Melachim that, in fact, is describing an act of indiscretion, even rebelliousness, on the part of Achav. We've noted this passage in another context as well. The battle between Israel and Aram that is described in the latter part of Melachim Aleph Perek Kaf, and what is germane for our purposes is the realization, on the one hand, that indeed Achav was not to be compassionate to the king of Aram or his subjects, because they were engaging in an unprovoked war of aggression against Israel. And you shouldn't be compassionate under such circumstances. But the point that we want to emphasize right now, that was an observation that we made in a different set of circumstances. The point that we want to emphasize right now is that, okay, Aram has been routed, obviously providentially, by Yisrael. And just consider what the Aramaim presume with respect to Am Yisrael. That is, in as much as Ben Hadad, Melech Aram, is really in devastating circumstances. He's fled, he's hiding, and by all reasoning, after having launched this war of aggression against Israel, he should be summarily executed. His servants say, the kings of Israel do chesed. So let's engage in this whole ruse of seeming to be submissive because they have the upper hand right now. And so they go out to Melech Israel wearing sackcloth and showing utmost submission. And they say to Achav Melech Israel, Avdecha ben Hadad amar techina nafshi, your servant Ben Hadad is saying, please let me stay alive. And Achav's reaction is, oh, he's still alive, he's my brother, excuse me, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. And he shows excessive benevolence to Ben Hadad. Funny, he didn't show excessive benevolence, for example, to Navot HaYisraeli. He didn't show excessive benevolence to all of the prophets who were slain by Izebel. But my point here is, on the most elementary plane, where did this conviction come from that Malchei Yisrael ki Malchei Chesed hem? There obviously was a character trait here. I humbly posit it is not something that can be in any way, shape, or form associated with genetics. There's nothing genetic that makes Israel more compassionate. It's because of the way we live. It's because of the effect that Torah has upon us. And that effect that Torah has, ironically, pertains even to someone like Achav, who is not exactly known for his tremendous fidelity to the Torah. How so? Because there's a certain, if you will, metagenetic reality that embeds itself in Am Yisrael, and we've seen it, sadly, tragically, we've seen it also wear off. We see it, for example, in vast swaths of American Jewry that have become estranged from keeping Torah and mitzvot, up until a certain point. Up until what point? Well, at some point it wears off, but there is this ingrained sense of compassion that becomes absorbed by the nation by dint of having the Torah. And in as much as inertia is perhaps the strongest force in human affairs, it continues to persist among Jews even after they forsake the Torah for a certain period of time. The fact that eventually it wears off, unfortunately, is perhaps the most resounding demonstration that it isn't anything genetic. It's something that comes from the Torah. The Torah is so transformative, it becomes an ingrained reality that can persist even beyond the actual practical fidelity to keeping mitzvot. And this arguably is the same dimension that is enunciated by the Gemara in Masechet Beitzah Daf Kaf Hey with respect to the Torah being given to Israel precisely mipnei shehen azin. Because if anything, and this maybe really is intended to be understood on something of a genetic or epigenetic level, that Israel have this ingrained character trait of brazenness. That trait of brazenness is so pronounced that if unattenuated, we have a tendency to become intolerable. And truth be told, you see this brazenness in people who are completely divorced from the Torah. You see, to some extent, the people who do have the Torah, but the Torah is supposed to, at the very least, attenuate it. And what essentially then does this convey? Once again, we're not talking about specific fidelity to a particular mitzvah. We're talking about being transformed by the totality of the Torah, the holism of the Torah. That very process whereby Torah starts out being Torah Hashem and becomes Torato, the Torah of the person. We are affected. And through that effect, we stop being so brazen. We become more tolerable. At least you ought to. And this idea then that through our keeping the Torah, we become affected not only in the actual act of keeping the Torah, is perhaps expressed in the most pronounced manner in what the Torah tells us with respect to the extirpation of the Ir Nidachat, the wayward city, and its consequences. Of course, the Torah tells us that once we have established unequivocally that the city is indeed guilty, we are to slay the inhabitants of this city, not just them, also the livestock, to destroy all of the property thereof. And the Torah adds, you shall not take possession of any of the spoil that is designated for destruction, so that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will revert his wrath, and give you compassion and have compassion upon you. Which, of course, seems on the face of it to be completely redundant. Give you compassion, have compassion upon you. Same thing, no? Where the additional dimension is that all this is happening because of your fidelity to the mitzvah. And with respect to what is meant by this apparent redundancy, so first we'll note that the Tosefta already emphasizes this point. The implication of V'natan lecha rachamim v'richamcha is the compassion from Kivyachol HaKadosh Baruch Hu is because V'natan lecha rachamim, because you have compassion, which already implies then that V'natan lecha rachamim is not giving you Kivyachol his compassion, but making you compassionate. This idea is implicitly enunciated likewise by the Gemara Yevamot that speaks of the three signs of Am Yisrael being Rachmanim, Baishanim, V'Gomlei Chasadim. And again, we're going to reiterate, it is simply implausible to posit that Rachamim, Baishanim, V'Gomlei Chasadim has something to do with some native endowment. It is rather, as we saw it, because you heed the mitzvah of Hashem, you become transformed. This is you, because you're giving the Torah and you're transformed by it. And inevitably, what that drives us to appreciating, and this becomes even more acutely accentuated in the classic commentators, is this V'natan lecha rachamim is not, as it were, that you will be a beneficiary of the compassion of Hashem, but rather you will become a compassionate person. Rashi says V'natan lecha rachamim she'derachem al b'riot, that you will have compassion on others. Rabbeinu Bachye emphasizes this point that V'natan lecha rachamim is endowing you with midat rachamim, and perhaps even further explicitly enunciating this point, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama in Akedat Yitzchak, in noting the extent to which despite your engaging in these destructive acts, in as much as what you are doing is in order to avert, as he expresses it, the sakanat nefashot atzuma, the grave danger that comes from the Chilul Hashem, the desecration of God's name in this wayward city. We need indeed in that response, in the extirpation of the wayward city, to cultivate midat achzariyut, li'itachzer al oyvei Hashem, to be cruel to the enemies of God. And to that extent, in as much as we need to cultivate that character trait that is so antithetical to compassion, despite that, you will become compassionate. You'll become compassionate in the sense that, as he expresses it, precisely through your fidelity to the mitzvah, your character will become refined. This is an idea that is perhaps most explicitly enunciated by the Or HaChaim, Rabbi Chaim ibn Attar. I must note that there is something that is excruciatingly familiar in what he describes. Remember, the Or HaChaim HaKadosh was here. And when he considers the ramifications of the slaying of the Inidachat, the wayward city, even the livestock, this kind of behavior is going to naturally inure an individual to cruelty, make a person cruel. And he says, it's translated directly as the Arab executioners of the king relate to us. They told us this. They get all excited. They have lust to kill a person. And that natural tendency towards compassion has been completely cut off from them. This is Or HaChaim writing. So this is a kind of natural process when it becomes so inured to cruelty that it becomes cruel and just lusting after murdering people. And to that extent, those who slay the wayward city are liable to become the same thing. And by consequence, this is a promise that if you obey the mitzvah, first, God is going to give you rachamim. You won't become a cruel, brutal thug. Rather, because you're doing it exclusively out of fidelity to the mitzvah, you'll become a rachaman. Even though naturally one would tend towards cruelty, nonetheless, through fidelity to the mitzvah, you will become compassionate. And what he emphasizes, of course, the conclusion, which is the inevitable conclusion of the passage. The emphasis in the final verse that you are heeding the commandment of Hashem, is essentially the reason behind this promise that you will indeed acquire this character trait of compassion. If you would be slaying the residents of the wayward city as some personal vendetta, yesh makom lanim shach me'adabar, then it is perfectly natural to assume that one will become further inured towards violence and become a cruel person. But the only reason you're slaying the Yom Nidachad is because you're obeying the Torah's mitzvah. You're obeying the command of the king. As a result, you won't be overcome by brutality, but on the contrary, through the fidelity to the mitzvah, you will acquire the character trait of compassion. And then, of course, the next stage, that Hashem will also have compassion on you. But you will acquire this trait of compassion by virtue of your fidelity to the mitzvah. Again, not merely the obeying of the mitzvah, but the transformation of your character by dint of what it is that you're doing. And we should note, Rambam emphasizes this as simultaneously an acquired trait, and even more so as something that disposes an individual to hearing kivyachol, the divine word. We have noted in other contexts that Rambam, in the second unit of the Guide of the Perplexed, where he speaks of the chapters on prophecy, concludes the section with a typology of different levels of prophecy. This is in chapter 45. Well, chapter 45 is like the concluding chapter of the section, except there are another 3 addenda, which is why there's also chapter 46, chapter 47, and chapter 48, which aren't really relevant with respect to this discussion. What is, of course, is the typology in chapter 45, and in particular what's relevant is, while Rambam gives us a typology of different levels of prophecy, he begins the typology with 2 levels that he describes as pre-prophetic. And the first of these pre-prophetic levels is, as he expresses it, שיילווה לאיש עזר אלוקי שיניעהו ויזרזהו למעשה טוב גדול כהצלת קהל חשובים מקהל רעים, או הציל חשוב וגדול, או השפיע טוב על אנשים רבים. The first level is that one feels accompanied by some divine assistance, a kind of quasi-divine force that impels an individual to do good things for people, to save those who are oppressed, to save a particular individual who is endangered, to bestow goodness on many people. And he finds within himself the dynamo that is driving him to behave in this manner. Rambam says this is what is described as Ruach Hashem, the Spirit of God that comes upon, in particular, we see, comes upon the judges in their going out to do battle. We see it also with respect to the righteous kings. And Rambam, moreover, emphasizes this point as something that characterized Moshe from the get-go. This is something that is striking when one considers the implications of Moshe's early biography. Says Rambam, when Moshe sees a miscarriage of justice taking place, the Egyptian is beating the hapless Hebrew slave, he gets up and kills him. He can't tolerate seeing injustice. I like to append to Rambam's description what I think is a simple pshat. When the Torah tells us, "Vayifen kova chovaya ki ein ish vayachet hamitzri vayitmenu b'chol," that Moshe looked this way and that and saw there was no man, and smote the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So why did he look this way and that? Because the simple answer is to see that no one is looking. But based upon this Rambam, I'd like to propose an alternative. He sees this grievous miscarriage of justice. He sees this injustice being perpetrated, and he looks around and sees who's going to get up and act. How can you tolerate such behavior? And he sees no one's getting up. And all of a sudden he realizes he's the one who has to get up. And he gets up and he kills the Egyptian. This is a transformation of an individual. Now, of course, you could rightly argue this isn't a formal illustration of the thesis because Moshe is not transformed by dint of having the Torah. He doesn't have the Torah yet. First of all, obviously, this is a reciprocity. This is part of the process that readies him to receive the Torah. And simultaneously, I'll also note that, again, there is an underlying premise here that a transformation needs to take place in a person. Granted, for us, it's going to take place through the Torah. For Moshe, he didn't have the Torah. It was taking place on an additional plane. But that Ruach Hashem that we can seize upon, and yes, that we can distill from the Torah, is going to transform us. Not merely in obedience to a quantifiable mandate, but to dispose us to doing what is right, even when there is no clear, quantifiable mandate, because it has generated that moral growth within us. Moshe wasn't aware of any quantifiable mandate. We can say, to not stand idly by your brother's blood, but that's not what was impelling Moshe. What was impelling him was resonance with Ruach Hashem, with the Spirit of God. Arguably, we get that out of the Torah. And that is critically the first step in the process that leads an individual towards Nevuah. Now, inevitably, this perspective has far broader implications pertaining to the whole notion of how the mitzvot are to transform us. And in this vein, we note the Midrash. The Midrash appears in multiple places in somewhat divergent forms. We will note that Rambam quotes this Midrash in Moreh Nevuchim, Guide to the Perplexed, Unit 3, Chapter 26, and Ramban quotes this Midrash as well in his commentary on the mitzvah of sending away the mother bird before taking the young in Parashat Ki Tetzei, where he has an element of dissension with Rambam. We hope to touch on that a little bit later. But in as much as we have the imperative to keep the mitzvot, the underlying question that is tacitly enunciated in the Midrash, to skip to the final sentence to appreciate the one that precedes it. What difference does it make, as it were, in the realm of the divine, whether you slaughter an animal by slitting its throat or you clubber it over the back of its head? And the message in the Midrash, that the mitzvot are given to us to refine us through them. So obviously, even though the Midrash doesn't take this explicitly, we understand that clubbering an animal over the back of its head is going to be a very painful way to dispatch the animal. The slitting of the throat is rather, on the contrary, intended to be the most painless way of dispatching the animal, in particular because, by consequence, the moment that the carotid artery is severed, blood pressure in the brain goes to zero, there is immediate loss of consciousness. So there can be no pain. And ironically, it is precisely what makes shechita so apparently gory and revolting that ensures the animal doesn't suffer. I'll note an esteemed rabbinic colleague and friend, Rav Evers, has a teshuvah responding to the attempts, in particular in Europe, to outlaw shechita, and he makes the novel proposition that shechita is intended to be simultaneously the most painless way to dispatch the animal and aesthetically the most revolting, the most gory, because you shouldn't take it for granted that you can take this animal's life. So you should feel the disgust, the revulsion with seeing all the blood and the gore, and you should also ensure the animal doesn't suffer. And those two, ironically, are linked. So the Midrash is enunciating this point about that the mitzvot are given in a manner that demands of us refinement. In other words, obviously, on the level of the divine, it could have been cover the animal over the head, but there's a message for us that we need to ensure the animal won't suffer. And this inevitably brings us back to the Gemara, the Midrashim that we discussed previously when we spoke of the Torah as the authoritarian chok. That is again in Yoma, page 67b, the Sifra in Parashat Acharei Mot on Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 4, and likewise the Tanchuma in Parashat Mishpatim. And in all of them, as we noted, there is a bifurcation established between the chok and the mishpat, where the chok is to engrave, to establish something as an inviolable rule, even though you don't understand it at all. Versus the mishpat milshon shofet, to judge, judgment, something that you can judge as that with which you are resonant. And the way, of course, the Gemara expresses this is even had they not been written, it would have been appropriate for them to have been written. In other words, they are written, but you resonate with these mitzvot because you have that inner sense of justice. Again, the moral compass that has been bludgeoned into submission but has not been bludgeoned to death. And if anything, on the contrary, the implication of these mitzvot is it's not merely a matter of obeying a quantifiable divine mandate, even though it is one, but rather that you cultivate an inner attitude that disposes you to these mitzvot. Of course, again, the mitzvot are precisely from the list of the 7 Noachide laws. The list is always, as we've noted, invariable. 5 of the 7 Noachide laws, the omission of dinim and the omission of ever minachai, tearing a limb off of a living animal and eating it. But the idea that there are mitzvot that indeed constitute a rational imperative, and they will dispose us to resonating with them. Pardon me, we're having some technical problems. Okay. And to further amplify that message, we consider in particular 2 passages in the Gemara in Masechet Bava Metzia. When we consider what is within the scope of the mitzvot, as in the words of Yitro, v'hizharta ethem et hachukim ve'et hatorot. You're supposed to warn Israel about the chukim, the Torahs, And what is included as distinct from the chukim and the Torah in the derech, the way upon which they should go, and the deed, the maaseh that they should be doing. And the Gemara says, "Et derech zogim chasadim." Derech, way, refers to engaging in acts of kindness. What characterizes acts of kindness? This is going to be directly germane in another few lines as well. Chesed is lifnim mishurat adin. How do we translate lifnim mishurat adin? Discuss this. It's not beyond the letter of the law, because beyond the letter of the law is out of bounds, and lifnim doesn't mean beyond, it means within. To be able to read between the lines, to have that sense of doing what is right, even when there's no quantifiable mandate, because Gimel Chasadim is not something that has a quantifiable mandate. On the contrary, Gimel Chasadim is something that doesn't have any measure to it. But nonetheless, engaging in Chesed, Yelechu, Zebikur Chalim, Va, Kvura, Et HaMaaseh, Zehadin, Asher Yasun, Zolifnim Mishurat Adin, and the Gemara expands upon this to include visiting the sick, to include burying the dead, to include not just justice, but Lifnim Mishurat Adin, reading between the lines. And indeed, the Gemara goes on to express this in the harshest of terms. Rabbi Yochanan says that Yerushalayim was destroyed because they judged their only din Torah. The Gemara explains, because they judged according to the letter of the law, v'lo avdu lifnim mishurat adin, and no one was reading between the lines. There wasn't that aspect of lifnim mishurat adin. And perhaps even more forcefully, the story that the Gemara presents in Masechet Bava Metzia on page 83a about Rabba Bar Chanan, who hires workers to carry the barrels of wine that he needs to have transported, and they botched up. As Rashi notes, clearly this is the context. It was pshia, it was their recklessness, their dereliction. They break the barrels. And since they caused him this tremendous financial ruin, he takes their overcoats. Shakal glimayu. So they go and complain to Rav, the ranking sage, and Rav says to Rabbi Bar Chanan, give him their coats. Really, dinach? What about all the names he calls me? Doesn't matter. Amayli in, yes. Dinahachi. Leman telech bederech tovim. Quoting the verse from Mishlei, from Proverbs, you should go in the way of the good. Obviously, this is not din. This is lifnim mishurat adin. But Rav is calling it din. And after he gives them the coats, these brothers have some chutzpah. They say, we're poor, we worked all day long, we're hungry. We don't have anything to eat because we didn't get paid, because we broke the barrels. And Rav says to Rabbi Bar Chanan, pay them their wages. Their wages for what? What did they do? All they did was break the barrel. And again, Rabbi Bar Chanan asks, Dina Achi, that's the law? Amar Le'in. And Rav quotes the other half of the same pasuk in Proverbs, Ve'orchot tzadikim tishmar, to keep the paths of the tzadikim, of the righteous. And well, of course, it would be very difficult to say that this is intended to be quantifiable halacha, but nonetheless, this is dinach. This is something that we need to internalize as the procedural bottom line for how we need to act. Why? Because lifnim mishurat adin is din, so to speak. Reading between the lines is part of what you need to get from the lines themselves. And this is an idea that we should note Rambam accentuates in an interesting context. In God of the Perplexed, in Unit 3, Chapter 17, where Rambam distinguishes the Torah's view of hashgacha pratit, individuated providence, from that of various others, without going into the others, but nonetheless. And what Rambam emphasizes is that this integration of right and wrong doesn't apply only when there is in fact a quantifiable right and wrong. Because when we consider the message that is, as it were, enunciated by Hashem in the Torah, it is that when you do what is right, even if you weren't required to do it, there is a reward. And when you do what is wrong, even if there wasn't any explicit prohibition that was violated, then you get punished. Because anytime a person knows what right and wrong is, it doesn't matter if there's a quantifiable mandate or quantifiable prohibition. You need to do what's right. As Rambam expresses it, achar shu davar sha'asechel mazhir mimeno, ritzoni lomar ha'hazhara min ha'avel ve'achamas. Once there is this cognizance on the part of the mind that this is something you shouldn't be doing, then it obligates you, even if you don't have a quantifiable mandate in the Torah. And of course, again, the positive flip side of the coin, we encounter this principle enunciated on many occasions in the Gemara, that when you do what is right, even though it isn't required. So we have a principle, that when someone is obligated to do something, he is considered more laudable and is more richly rewarded than when someone does something that he is not obligated to do. But nonetheless, the latter is also rewarded. And if anything, we have the principle that God does not withhold from any creature reward for the positive actions that that individual has done, because that's foundational. That is, everything ultimately is right and wrong, and there's reward and punishment. And this brings us to an additional dimension, and this additional dimension we've already noted, but now it's really germane in particular, and that is what Rambam presents as an ostensible dissension between the philosophers and the sages. In what vein? In that, as Rambam notes, we have many statements of the sages that indicate that one should conquer one's passions, conquer one's yetzer hara, one's drive toward evil. To the extent that one has the desire to do the misdeed, and one forces oneself not to do so. And Rambam notes in the 6th chapter of his introduction to Avot, the 6th of the 8th chapter introduction, that this is something that flies in the face of what the philosophers argue, which is that if a person has no desire to do what's wrong, he's considered loftier than one who has a desire to do what's wrong and simply forces himself not to do so. And Rambam explains it's not a contradiction. It depends in what domain of mitzvot. As we've noted, is that to the extent that Rambam cites indeed the statement in the Sifra on Parashat Kedoshim that one shouldn't say, I have no desire to eat meat and milk, to engage in forbidden kilayim, to engage in forbidden sexual relationships, but rather I have the desire, but what can I do? My Father in heaven commanded upon me that I should not commit these wrongdoings. And Rambam's emphasis is that we find no corresponding statement that a person shouldn't say, I have no desire to commit murder, to steal, to lie. Rather, I would love to, but my Father in heaven decreed upon me that I should not. There's no such statement. Because, again, we reiterate that in a moral sense, not only was not bludgeoned to death, not only is it alive and kicking, but you need to cultivate it. You should be transformed by keeping the mitzvot, so you have no desire to murder, to steal, to lie. With respect to those mitzvot, on the contrary, the Torah should be transforming you as a person, making you into a more moral being. Not only because you are obeying the specific imperatives of the Torah that forbid murder, stealing, lying. Of course, there are quantifiable imperatives, but it's more than that, because the Torah is changing you as a person. Apropos of the way we began. Remember? The Torah starts out being the Torah of God, becomes your Torah. That which the Torah forbids on that plane, I have no desire to do. On that plane. Rambam emphasizes that with respect to the mitzvot that the Midrash in fact cites, that is, eating milk, kilayim, shatnez, forbidden sexual relationships, that's a different story. Those are mitzvot shim'iyot. We obey them only because the Torah tells us we need to do them. Employing the distinction famously drawn by Rav Saadia Gaon between mitzvot shim'iyot and mitzvot sichliot, to which Rambam really doesn't subscribe, but nonetheless he employs it here, that mitzvot shim'iyot are mitzvot that exist exclusively as a code of discipline. You obey them because you obey them. And mitzvot sichliot, with which your intellect resonates. You do them because, again, as we saw the formulation in Tractate Yoma, page 67b, even if it wouldn't be written in the Torah, you would feel natural resonance. So again, the Torah as generator of that inner moral growth. And what that brings us to is a broader aspect, which we'll perforce because our time is limited, note only briefly, but it's a foundational dimension, at least among many of our commentators, certainly Rambam among them, but it's something we certainly find grounded in the Gemara and in the Midrash, the significance of Tamei Mitzvot, looking for reasons for mitzvot. Now we know we don't do the mitzvot because we have reasons for them, but still and all, we have ample examples that enunciate the idea that there are reasons. The Gemara in Pesachim speaks of Tamei Torah. Indeed, the Tosefta in Kiddushin speaks of that which was revealed to Avraham, as encompassing Ta'amei Torah v'dikdukea, again, ostensibly, reasons for the Torah. The Gemara in Perek Chelek of Sanhedrin speaks of the rendezvous of Achia Shiloni and Yeravam as explaining the words of the pasuk in Sefer Melachim, Ushnehem levadam basadeh, shekol tamei Torah migulaim lahem kasadeh, that all of the reasons of the Torah are as revealed to them as a field. In other words, a prodigious level of understanding. And likewise, we have this idea in the Midrash, again referring to Ta'amei Torah, an idea that appears repeatedly in Chazal, perhaps the final tour de force, if you will, that in Otzar Midrashim we find the portrayal that in L'Atid Lavo, the world of the future, the Holy One, blessed be He, reveals Ta'amei Torah Yisrael, explaining those mitzvot that in this world are pure enigmas, and it's precisely after revealing the Ta'amei Torah that all of the righteous are invited to enter into Gan Eden and eat the repast that is prepared for the righteous for the hereafter. So there's significance to understanding that there are Ta'amei Mitzvot. We may not know them, but we need to know that they exist. We discussed when we spoke of the Torah as the authoritarian, inscrutable chok, the final halacha in Rambam's Mishnah Torah, Sefer Avodah, that is, Hilchot Me'ilah, Perek Chet, Halacha Chet. Rambam refers to that halacha At the end of Sefer Karbanot, the last halacha in Sefer Karbanot, which is in Hilchot Murah, chapter 4, halacha 13, where Rambam says, even though all of the laws of the Torah are gezerot, they are decrees, as we explained at the end of Ne'ilah, still and all, you should strive to contemplate them. The more reasons you can come up with, the better. Why? It's clear. Because by giving ta'amim, that's not the reason you're going to keep the mitzvah, but that is going to engage in that inner transformation, because your intellect now is going to be molded by the mitzvah. And this becomes, of course, the major enterprise of Rambam in the closing portion of Moreh Nevuchim. The second half of the third chelek of Moreh Nevuchim is about Ta'amim Mitzvot, where Rambam emphasizes, in particular in Unit 3, Chapter 26, where he first enunciates the idea that everything that God does has a reason with respect to the mitzvot, that we believe that every mitzvah has a reason, even if we don't know what those reasons are. As we've discussed in other contexts, the reason it is so important for Rambam to stress this point, to stress that we see all of the mitzvot as derivative of divine wisdom, is because the foremost tool that we have for coming to God is our intellects. If we're not going to engage our intellects in striving to understand the mitzvot, we may be doing the mitzvot, maybe fulfilling our obligation, but now our essence of what we are is left out in the cold. Don't leave it in the cold. Strive to come up with an understanding of the Ta'amei Mitzvot. It is significant to note in this regard, I'll just note this very briefly, that Rambam cites the midrash that we noted at the beginning about slaughtering an animal rather than clubbering it over the head, and the manner in which Rambam understands lo nitnu mitzvot ela letzaref be'en habriot, the mitzvot were given exclusively litzrof bahem, to refine us through them, implying a certain element of enigma in the mitzvot, is to distinguish between the generality of the mitzvah and the particular nuances and subtleties of the mitzvah, regarding which Rambam says you can't seek Ta'amei Mitzvot. If we ask why for Rambam it is so important to enunciate that distinction, I'll enunciate this point briefly, but nonetheless I think it's important to make the observation, because from Rambam's perspective, Ta'amei Mitzvot necessarily are conceptual, rational. Rambam undoubtedly was aware that there are alternative systems that enable an individual to explain the subtleties of the mitzvah as well. But those systems are not rational. Kabbalistic reasons for the mitzvah are certainly not going to be on Rambam's radar screen. So he says, you need to look for reasons for the generality of the mitzvah. And if you don't, you're missing the point. And you need not to look for reasons for the subtleties of the mitzvah. And if you do, you're missing the point. Those two are both off the path of truth, because Rambam is concerned with giving us reasons with which our intellects will resonate, because that, after all, is the most important thing. And in what vein will they indeed resonate? So Rambam at the end of the chapter talks about the need for there to be some utility in the mitzvah. He further enunciates this idea in saying that the mitzvot all have a discernible utility to them, and he stresses that he regards this as a central part of his agenda in the guide. He's going to divide up all 613 commandments into groups, 14 groups, and then analyze what each of them says, what each of them conveys, how we are to understand each one. And I'm going to take them one by one and explain their reasons, because this is really foundational for Rambam in order for us to be transformed through the mitzvot. And what sort of reasons are the reasons to which Rambam will appeal? And this is a central principle that he enunciates in chapter 28, where he says that the mitzvah needs to be either to cast away some aspect of injustice or cultivate a positive character trait. Alternatively, to cultivate a true intellectual doctrine and cast away false intellectual doctrines, and the refinement of society in order to provide an appropriate stage through which one can actualize one's potential. And essentially, everything from Rambam's perspective needs to be understood in that vein, except for, as he says, certain mitzvot that are still an enigma to him, precisely because those mitzvot are posits, are resonating with aspects of pagan practices with which we may today be completely unfamiliar. This is something that he further stresses in chapter 31. We'll note likewise in the Igeret to Harav Hagadol Rabbi Chasdai Halevi Asfaradi, even though the Igeret is of uncertain provenance, it's not clear that Rambam actually wrote this Igeret, but certainly was written under influence of Rambam. And the emphasis in Rambam, all of the Torah, is nimusim mishmarot lanefesh. It is means for the refinement of and safeguarding of the soul. And moreover, if we were to regard the mitzvot as mere decrees, then why does the Torah emphasize, specifically with respect to the chukim, that it is your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations? When they hear these chukim, they will say, this great nation is wise and sagacious. They'll say that because even the chukim manifestly are resonant with chokhmah elokit, with divine wisdom, and we'll be able to sense that wisdom. And maybe just to emphasize one additional dimension that has its roots in Rambam, and is certainly germane in this discussion. Rambam, in the second unit of the guide, in chapter 31, in his treatment of Shabbat, enunciates the importance of translating ideas into deeds. That deeds, if they aren't established and publicized and perpetuated in the multitude through actions forever, will not be able to sustain the deot, the views, the ideas that are of such importance to inculcate among us. It seems clear to me that this line in Rambam is the inspiration for the central principle that everyone associates with Sefer HaChinuch. After the deeds, the hearts are drawn. And perhaps that's the most appropriate place for us to conclude, because it really is the most dramatic illustration of the Torah as a generator of inner moral growth, is it not? You do the deed, it will affect you. The deed may not in itself explicitly invoke the principles that need to be inculcated in the person. Indeed, Sefer HaChinuch enunciates this idea first in a rather seemingly technical mitzvah of not breaking the bones of the Paschal offering. But again, you do the deed, you are transformed by the deed. You keep the Torah, you are transformed by the Torah. And the Torah becomes transformed into your Torah. The Torah becomes a generator of inner moral growth that ultimately is transformative. This then takes the discussion one step beyond, again, what we noted last time, which was the Torah as a divinely ordained moral code. Because this isn't just a code. This is on some plane giving us a ball and telling us to run with it. the Torah indeed as a generator of inner moral growth. And it disposes us for Be'ezrat Hashem, the last chapter in this progression, which is going to be beyond mere morality. The Torah is the guide to transcendent godliness, with which, Be'ezrat Hashem, we look forward to concluding this odyssey next time.